Good afternoon. Welcome to Ron's Ramblings. This will be number 13 in the series. This will be the fourth part of Noah's life. We're going through the lives of those recorded in Hebrews chapter 11, that is commonly called the roll call of the faithful. And we're looking at Noah's life now, and we have been looking at it for a while. And when we ended part 3 of his life, we looked at verse 5 of Genesis chapter 1, where it stated, "And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day." That ended the first day of creation. And I had a chart that you saw in the last time that showed 7 things that we considered there on that day. But there are 2 in particular that I want to refresh in your memory, because what we talk about today is going to be applicable to those 2 things. The first thing that was created, and the first thing that is mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, is God created the heaven and the earth. And that's the 2 things that I want to talk about for just a minute, to review and refresh in your mind what we're talking about here. The first was the Shamay, the word that is rendered heaven in some translations, including the King James Version. But actually the Shamay that God created was a terrifically vast space. It was room for God to put all of the things that he was about to create. And there was nothing before that. And what he created was the space in order to put his creation. It was empty when he finished creating it, because everything else was yet to be created. And then the second thing was what's rendered earth in most translations. And it is the Eretz, E-R-E-T-S, I think is the way that the Hebrew word is. And the Eretz is what will become the planet on which we live. But at the time that God created it, in the second verse of Genesis, it was considered to be without form, shapeless and void, valueless or worthless, and darkness prevailed. In the third verse of Genesis, God creates light. And then in verse 4, he separates the light from the darkness, the evening and the morning. And as a result of that, he creates day. And at the end of that, it is the end of the first day, as we see on the screen. Now, everything that we talk about after that takes place not on the first day, but on days 2 through 6. We're going to talk about day 2 today. As day 2 begins, the earth, the Eretz, that mass shapeless water that God created, now there's light, so it can be seen. And I don't know what it looks like, but one of the things that I think of when I hear the description of the Eretz being shapeless and void, but yet water, I assume it is a great mass of water. And for some reason or other, I pretty much always imagine it being kind of a chaotic ocean of water, with the waves pretty much just doing whatever they need to do, as you see in this photograph. But it probably didn't look like this at all, because if you stop and think about it, the atmosphere had not yet been created. There was no wind, and so there's a very good chance that instead of it looking like this, that it might have been just a smooth surfaced, uh, still lake of water, as we kind of imagine sometimes. And if it's that way, then it doesn't matter. It's still water, it's still shapeless, and it's still not good for anything. But God intends for there to be something less than worthless when he gets through. In fact, it's great. The next slide tells us the beginning of the second day. And the way it is worded is, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which are above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. That's 3 short verses that tell us everything that happened the second day. But yet, there's more there than we see just by a casual reading of those verses. First off, let's talk about the thing that was created. It is the firmament. That word occurs 5 times in these 3 verses. Some Bible versions use the word sky. Some Bible versions use the word heaven as opposed to the atmosphere. Some use the word atmosphere, and others use the word canopy. It just depends on which translation that you happen to be reading. But the King James Version and most of the older versions, if you will, still use the word firmament. And the thing that I want you to see, even though we're going to talk about these things a little later, I want you to see right now that there is a particular thing that happens when God creates the firmament, and that is a second division. Now you remember back up in verse 4, we saw where God had created light, and he had separated day and night. That would be the first separation. Now, here in these verses, we see God creating another thing, the firmament, the sky, the atmosphere, the canopy, whatever you want to use. And the purpose of it is more than just a single purpose. It's more than just twofold or threefold. But one of the things that it does is it divided the waters that were above it from those that were below it. And we want to talk about that to some extent a little bit later. But before we do, I want to talk about the firmament and what the firmament consisted of and the way that it was created and that kind of thing. So let's look at that. Verse 6 says, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. The Hebrew word that is translated firmament is the word rakia. And Strong's dictionary defines that word as meaning expanse. So actually, it was a great expanse that God had created. Strong's dictionary takes it one step further than that, though, and says that it apparently means the visible arch of the sky. Actually, the Hebrew word rakia is found 17 times in the King James Version of the Bible. And I think Strong is getting his idea about the visible arch of the sky from those times where we see it written. I think what he understands is the context in which those things are described elsewhere than just here in the first chapter of Genesis. Obviously, 9 of those instances occur right here in the first chapter of Genesis, but the others are elsewhere. There's 2 times that it is found in the book of Psalms. Psalm 19, verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." That tells us a lot. The handiwork, we can see what God created by this firmament or in this firmament. And then in the 150th Psalm, it is said, "Praise ye the Lord, praise him in the firmament of his power," indicating that we can see his power from what we find in the firmament. It also occurs 5 times in the book of Ezekiel, even occurs once in the book of Daniel. Those are apocalyptic books, and there's a lot of symbolism involved in those books. But each time that it's used, the word firmament stands for the glory of God and us and the ability to see that glory. Well, in this verse, it's called, in the verses that we're looking at, it's called heaven. Now, I have put on the slide verses 1 of Genesis chapter 1 and verse 8 of Genesis chapter 1. Prior to this, back when we spoke of the first verse in Genesis, the word heaven meant Shammai, as I reminded you just a few minutes ago. And now we find here in Genesis verse 8, Genesis 1 verse 8, that God calls this firmament heaven. I want you to notice something, if you will, about those 2 verses that I have quoted on the screen there. You will notice that in one of those verses, the word heaven is not capitalized. That's verse 1, Genesis 1:1. And it is capitalized in verse 8, Genesis 1, verse 8. That's not my doing. I did not put that there. I looked in all of the Bible versions that I have, and with one exception, and maybe 2, depending on what really is being said in that version, essentially all of the versions have this capitalization in verse 8 and the absence of capitalization in verse 1, indicating that there is a difference here. In verse 1, it was a generic term. God created the heavens and the earth. And in this verse, God is saying that this firmament that he creates, he called it heaven with a capital H. And as best I can determine, there is definitely a difference between those 2 Hebrew words that are used that makes it so that the translators chose to capitalize the word heaven. You will notice, as I said in verse 1, the word is Shammai. In verse 8, the verse is a derivative of the word Shammai. And the word that is used still means lofty, the same thing that Shammai meant, the empty space that is created, or that was created. But this word is a derivative of that word, and it adds a little to it. This word is where the other word is pronounced Shammai. Notice it has an E in the English spelling of it. In this word, it has an A where that E was in the English spelling of it. It is pronounced shamayim. Shamayim. Now you might look at that Y-I-M and think that it might be related to the word Y-O-M, yom, which is translated day in many Bible translations. But it isn't tied to that at all. The word shamayim is a limit that is placed on the word shamay. Spence says that God limited what could be seen there. That doesn't really explain it to my satisfaction. But it does give us a good idea of what is kind of meant by the word firmament or sky as it's rendered in some Bible translations. And certainly it gives us a clue to what Strong said was the definition of rakia, the visible arch of the sky. Spence says, to get the right definition or meaning for the word shamayim, it means what you see if you walk outside and you stand up and look at the sky. Now, I can kind of understand that. Of course, in the daytime, when you go out and look up at the sky, you see the sun, the clouds, the birds. You see cloud formations due to the wind and the swirls that are up there. You essentially see those things that are there in the sky for us to see. The primary thing being the atmosphere that we breathe, the air that's there, and the sun that dominates the day. But at night, when you go look at the sky at night, you see something entirely different. If we go outside, say on a clear, cloudless summer night, and we look up into the sky, we see the firmament that is defined in verse 8. We might not see what I have pictured on the screen for you to look at, because this was taken with the Hubble telescope. Our naked eye can't see that far. So we see the prominent stars, the things that are either large enough so that we can still see them even though they're hundreds or thousands of light years away. Or we see satellites that have been put up there, man-made satellites, which are becoming pretty numerous in the evening sky. But more than that, we see the moon. That would be the dominating feature that we see. But if we get a telescope and we look up into the sky with that telescope, we see more. We see further, and we can bring into focus those things that our naked eye can't see. And the more powerful our telescopes are, the further we can see, and the more we can see. And that's why I put one of the Hubble telescope images on the screen. The Hubble telescope is the telescope that reaches further, I guess, than anything else that we can see, that allows us to see the depth of that sky. I don't think there will ever be a telescope that's powerful enough to allow us to really see the entire firmament as God created it. We don't know how big it is. We don't know how far-reaching it is, but we know that it's there, and God created it. But at the time that we're speaking of, at the time when the second day, when the firmament was created, you couldn't see what I have shown on the screen because that didn't exist yet. There were no planets, there were no stars as we see them. What we would see is complete darkness. Remember, it's during the night that we went out, not anything in the sky, because it hasn't been created yet. Well, that's the firmament. The firmament is that vast expanse in which everything that we see in our universe exists. The sun, our sun, which we're beginning to learn is not even close to being the largest star there is in the sky. But it's our sun, and this is our planet, Earth. Some ask, do you believe that there may be life somewhere else in the solar system? I don't know. Frankly, it does not go against God's word if there is. The word that we have is God's word to us here on this planet. If in fact he created another world somewhere, then his word would have been given to them as well. The firmament, it is that vast, open atmosphere that we call heaven. Now, in Genesis 1, verse 6, I ask you to not overlook the second separation that was being talked about there in verse 6, to divide the waters from the waters. Verse 7 tells us that the firmament's purpose was to divide the waters under the expanse being another word for firmament, from the waters that were above the expanse. We've already defined the firmament as that vast expanse, that sky, specifically that atmosphere that we view, that we go outside and we can see and that we breathe. And as I said, the word firmament only occurs in the older translations of the Bible. And so that's why it's necessary to define what we mean by the word. In the later translations, later versions of Bibles, the word sky and atmosphere are used. In some, the word canopy is used. But it is the air, the sky, the things that we see. But now, to get the best understanding of what verse 6 says. Now remember, verse 6 talks about the dividing of the waters with the firmament or by the firmament. I think we need to look at the meanings of some of the words that are used there. So, what was God actually doing? Well, let's look at them. In both instances, we see the English translation of the word is to divide. That means to separate. Sometimes we view it as to separate into two parts. Sometimes we use the word divide to mean separate into multiple parts. But the exact same phrase is used in both of these instances. The word that, or what is translated divide, is not just one single Hebrew word. It is a combination of two Hebrew words. The first is the word badel, and it means to separate, to distinguish, to select, or to differ. And the second word in that two-word phrase that is translated divide is the word bane. And that means there is a distinction between the two. I can see my slide doesn't show that last line, but that's the meaning of it. It is a distinction between the two parts that are created by the division that is being spoken of here. And so the conclusion that we reach from those two Hebrew words is that the purpose of the firmament was to separate between the two, or to distinguish between the two. Now, in verse 4, when we talked about it, where God was dividing the light from the darkness, he is separating the two different elements, the element light from the element dark. And he is doing that for the purpose of distinguishing between the two. One of the elements he called day, the other element he called night. And so we can kind of see that rather easily. But what is being said here is different than that. That's what we how we defined the word in part 3 when we were talking about the division there. But here it means something different than that. In verse 6, we find God saying, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." The difference in meaning comes from the addition of the word translated midst in verse 6. God creates the firmament and places it in the midst of the waters. And as the second half of that verse says, God put the firmament in the midst of the waters and lets it divide the waters from the waters. Well, that doesn't tell us much, does it? So we say, God puts the firmament in the middle of the waters. That isn't what the word midst means. We take it to mean middle quite often, but that's not what the word means. The actual Hebrew word that is translated midst here is the Hebrew word tavek. And the meaning of tavek is to sever in half or to bisect the waters. The implication then to the Hebrew mind is that the firmament was placed in the middle of the waters. It would cut the waters in half, or it would make the waters be where an equal amount of water is above the firmament than is below the firmament. And I think that's the meaning that we need to look at. Well, I looked at the clock and I see we've gone over again, and I apologize for that. I just couldn't find a good stopping place. So we'll talk more about it in the next part, but try to get your mind around the word midst, meaning to sever or bisect the waters. This mass, this huge mass of water. Now, we know now how big our earth is. And at that time, it may have not been the same size as it is now when it was first created, when the Eretz was created. But once the water is separated, is bisected into two parts, an equal amount of water is going to be below the air that we breathe, the firmament that we're going to find. God puts the sun and the moon and the stars and all of those things. And what's above that firmament, and how that affects life on this earth. We'll look into that in the next part. I hope you have a good afternoon, and thanks for watching.